Welcome everyone to another edition of Snow Cone Diaries by Juan Valdez. These entries are sort of notes to self. They're learning exercises for me personally, as you kind of hash through and gel through some of these ideas. Things certainly get crystallized, and the ideas, the theoretical framework, the system that I'm constructing starts, evolves as you kind of articulate it. And I hope that, that occurs to those who are listening too. If you're a new listener, thanks for coming. If you've been here before, welcome back. Most of these talks are pretty advanced yoga and metaphysics types discussions. Today, I'm going to try and focus on meditation and nature of mind, and get into a little bit of Tantric yoga, transmutation of energy type principles, if I can get there. This might be another sort of mini-series, if you will, but this is the nature of mind and thought. As I talked a little bit about in previous diary entries, the first, I don't want to call it misconception necessarily, but the first kind of inversion that you need to take from a metaphysical standpoint is that you are not this body. You are not this physical form. It's not you. There is an aspect of you that inhabits it in a certain way, but it's not you. You have to get there. If you can't get there, you need to stop watching and you need to do some research. You need to look at near-death experiences primarily, and you need to start to take a look at what how it is that it might be possible that you can retain consciousness outside of the physical form. There's an independence there. They're like two atomic principles. They have to be for that data set to be true, for that data set to exist. There needs to be a separation in terms of principle of the physical form on the one hand, and that essential aspect of you from which your consciousness emerges, or which you associate your consciousness with, what we call the soul. You have to get there. And honestly, it took me close to 30 years to get there. So take your time. Okay? Take your time, do the research, ask yourself, start the internal dialogue, because that changes everything. In Theology Reconsidered, I have a chapter called The Death of the Soul, which is one of the unintended consequences, so to speak, of the Enlightenment and the scientific progress, the age of science that emerges. The age of science strikes down the soul, kills it. And here we are today, trying to rediscover whether or not it's even a thing. Okay, well, I'm here to tell you that it's a thing. And again, if you can't get there, you got to go back and do some homework and then come back. So once you start with that, we talked a little bit about yoga and the principles of yoga and sort of the 8 limbs of Patanjali specifically, and as they sort of, meditation kind of rests on these fundamental core principles about the management and maintenance of the physical form, which include, really its inputs and its outputs. Its inputs are, things that it ingests, the senses, the eyes, the food, everything, the sexual energies, things that inputs and outputs. That's what you need to think of it, and how to really establish a strong foundational structure such that you could experience and you could bring down higher levels of consciousness into the physical form and experience them, quote unquote, consciously versus the unconscious, that place of the mind that exists when we sleep, right? So if you get through that first leap, that we are spirit, or some element of spirit, it's really light, ultimately, you realize, okay, that so the soul exists. Here we are. How did we get into this body? how do we get into a place where we can express ideas with language, communicate with each other, and ultimately create the world around us with ideas and social structures and this sort of mass creative. It's an amazing miracle when you step back and think about it. And I'm not going to get into too much of this today, but we will get into this ultimately. We're in some sort of a artificially created, we're like biological artificial intelligence. Once the split is there, you have to come up with a mechanical explanation for what's going on. Like this whole religion thing, this whole spirit, the world of spirit, and ghosts and whatever, and demons, and it's all fucking noise, okay? Because really, what they don't want you to fully appreciate is that you are in a sort of biologically, artificially created construct. Now, it may have emerged naturally. There's some components that emerge naturally, obviously, and everything is nature ultimately, but the DNA structure, it sits at the very heart of life on this planet. And the fact that we this identity issue, can exist outside of the physical form. Well, how do you get into the physical form? It's a miracle. People, somebody has the tech. We don't. Okay? Our species doesn't, but somebody has the tech. Okay? So you got that's where that whole conclusion comes to at the end of that rabbit hole. So you need to take that, put it aside for a second. Okay? Now we're going to talk a little bit more about, and I try and keep things a little bit grounded and practical. We're going to be talking about optimizing the function of this physical form, of this machine that you've been given, which is, they call it the temple of God. It is the temple of God, because if you're ever going to realize God and understand what the hell's going on here, it's going to be through this physical form. That's the miracle, that something's been created that you can, in fact, experience the ultimate within in a conscious sort of way, where God can experience himself. Whoever that guy is, he's done an amazing job, because it works. He doesn't like it to happen, by the way. He's not rooting for you. He's not. This is what people don't understand. If you figure out the game's over. He doesn't want that to happen. Why would you want that to happen? He's probably wildly entertained by the nonsense going on down here. Wouldn't you be? You are. You watch the news. This guy, that guy, this guy. Wildly entertained. Anyway, so regardless of how we got here, you have this split. There's a mind and matter, right? A mind and matter. Spirit and matter, you could say. Flesh and spirit, right? So if you look at it in the Judeo-Christian mindset, we get into the philosophical aspect of that. You start with Descartes, res cogitans, res extensa, right? So you have this sort of the world of the mind, and then the world that's extended from the mind, right? So then you get this sort of mind-matter separation, which sits at as a sort of a fundamental dualistic principle in Western philosophical tradition, right? And we'll get into a little bit of that later. That is important, because the intellectual frameworks need to be established for this new way of thinking, right? This new metaphysics, the metaphysics of awareness is what I'm calling it. But I'm going to stick on the yoga side. We talked about the chakras and the energy centers, and basically that you've been given an energy reactor. It's a receiver and a transmitter of energy. That's basically what you've been given. And you have, in the earth, this world, you have the ability to create, literally with your hands. But with your mind, you can create, produce things, and then you have sort of a collective structure that's put us in a position today where the tech is where it is, which is that I'm talking to you now in your living room. I don't even know where you are, but it's amazing what's gone on. So this tuning exercise. So let's talk a little bit about meditation, what it's intended to do. Right, it has its health benefits. A lot of people on the spiritual journey go into meditation because they want to have, experience bliss. They want to experience God consciousness. I was sort of a bliss chaser for many years too. I get that. Go for it. Whatever gets you, honestly. But ultimately, and this is the piece that it's subtle, but most people miss this. All right, so you sit down for meditation. You are not your first, you are not your body. We've established that from a physics standpoint. That's the groundwork of all of our discussions. But then you have the mind, and you have thought. Well, you are not the mind. You are that which thinks of. Okay, well, then you get into sort of this sort of recursive, intellectual, tail chasing exercise, which in a way is sort of a cone. By the way, it's sort of its infinite nature yields a sort of mathematical structure that leads you in the right direction. Let's put it that way. And this is what I want to get into about thought. So, and I do have some notes here, which is good. Sorry, bear with me a second as I read through my notes. So, as a biomechanical engine, an energy reactor that you're trying to optimize, this idea of channeling, what is your relationship to thought is really the question. And the answer is that while it is also true that you are not your thought, it is also true that thoughts are the very essence of your being. And I've seen there's another guy on TikTok, his name escapes me right now, but he talks a lot about thought being the very nature of existence, and that the physical is a manifestation of the intellectual in a certain sense, a certain very real sense. And it is, and you can see that sort of logically, even though the connection is not always clear. But when you look at the mechanics of it, it is clear, and we do understand that the observer affects the reality that manifests. And the observer, in this case, you tie it even at a small kind of subatomic experimental level, you're still associating that observer with some level of intelligence. And so we know theoretically that thought influences the physical reality. You do this in heads, tails, coin experiments, the placebo effect. This is the sidebar example, but there's countless numbers of effects. Science doesn't like to deal with these things because it sort of seems magical and spooky, but the reality is that it's clear that there is a much tighter relationship between thought and the physical world than people, I think, really, particularly post-enlightenment, really truly appreciate and understand. So, when you're meditating, when you're focusing, and typically when you're focusing, the most constructive forms of meditation are the ones that are focused, which is why you have a mantra and a visualization symbol that typically you're given. And these are typically given from a teacher to a student, and in that ceremonial exercise there's an energy transmission that occurs. But that setting can be depending upon the relationship with the teacher and student. That can be a variety of settings, but that's typically, traditionally that's how the transmission has occurred, and therefore establishing lineage. So I have a lineage as well, for better or worse. Hopefully my teacher isn't rolling in his grave right now. But anyway, God bless his soul. So anyway, when you're, regardless of what the purpose is that you've sat down to actually meditate, the point I'm making is that it's effectively a tuning exercise. And that's the piece that I think a lot of people are missing, is that, it is sort of a biomechanical, artificially developed type of intelligence. It's an instrument and it runs on energy. And as such, like any other machine, it needs to be tuned. It's an amazing machine, but it still has various levels of performance based upon the actual form that you've been given. There are physical constraints, but also, the tuning that you do. And meditation is part of that tuning practice. And Om, the sound energy, right, is a good way to just tune it. Think of it as like just a tuning fork. And you're sort of resting in the flow of thought itself. Let it take you. Just put the suit on and get on the surfboard and just roll with it, man. And we as human beings, there's an element of free will, and we believe that we have the ability to create these channels through which thought occurs. This is part of the creative and the divine aspect of us. This is part of what our soul is capable of doing, is we can sort of structure and design how this body and how this mind ultimately is structured and architected. And it takes a long time to do this, a lot of repetition. This is why behavior is so important, why patterns are so important, why rituals are so important. You're basically taking a channel of energy and you're trying to flow it in a certain direction. And that's really, in meditation, we are taking that into sort of the mental sphere, so to speak. Because the physical form, okay, is an imprint of the, psycho-spiritual entity that you are. And all of your habits create imprints on the physical form. This is where addiction comes from. This is where, we basically have neuron patterns that fire in the brain that reflect these sort of mental imageries and power and patterns that we have. And then they become physically manifest. That's the miracle, right? But once they're physically manifest, particularly as you get older, to change those behaviors becomes very difficult, because you're hardwired, literally, for that behavior and for that way of thinking, which drives the behavior. So this sort of tuning exercise, once you start understanding that, you are energy, what's essentially you is energy. You have a biomechanical form that you're in charge of, but at the end it sort of runs itself once it's been set up, all the subconscious stuff. But you have, they call it in the Vedic tradition, they call it the buddhi, the intellect. You have the ability to architect this, and this is when you start to become a yogi. When you recognize the responsibility and you start directing that. But it's energy. And we are energetic beings. Right? And this sort of res cogitans, res extensa distinction that sort of sits at the heart, this dualistic, it sits at the heart of Western philosophy. Kant and some of the German idealists are an exception, but let's leave them aside for this sort of Enlightenment philosophical division. What we know with quantum mechanics is that everything is sort of related and that mind affects matter. And so reality, in a sense, is non-local. It's like a fabric that you're integrally connected to, that you can literally manipulate with your mind and your body. Your body is a function of your mind. So that's thought. You have to think about thought a little bit differently. You are not separate from your thoughts. You are separate from your thoughts, but you're not separate from your thoughts. Thought is sort of a finer level of existence and reality that, manifests itself in our physical world, but it has an element of independent existence. This is why Plato says that all thought is recollection. Okay, reflect on that for a second. All thought is recollection. All thoughts already exist. You're just tapping into them. And when you tap into a thought, it's like you're jumping into a stream. And then we have the ability to, and again, this is the miracle of man, the ability to express the thought in all sorts of ways. Music, language, paintings. They're ideas. This is why Plato was an idealist. This is the allegory of the cave. So, Plato got this. And then, then we got a little bit lost. So there's the one part of thought. How many minutes here? We're 20 minutes in. Okay. So I'm going to go into Tantra here a little bit. These are nobody's going to teach you this stuff. And probably for good reason, okay? So Tantra is a 2,000-year-old tradition that springs also from the Vedic heritage in India, which has this very rich spiritual mystic tradition stemming from the rishis and the Upanishads, the seers, the ancient seers, that knew these things. And it sort of developed. There's basically two ways to approach. There's 100 different ways to slice, this spiritual journey of God realization, which is ultimately what the Vedas speak of. And one is renounce, as Ramakrishna used to say about the Bhagavad Gita, neti, not this, not this, not this. Renounce. On the other hand, embrace. It's two ways. So you get the sort of Gnana Yoga, Karma Yogis that are just like, I'm just going to thin the ego and I'm going to, make that distinction between the real and the non-real, and I'm going to just do that hardcore until I get there. That's a path, and that will get you there. The other path, the Bhaktis and the Raha Yogis to a certain extent, using the 4 designations from Vivekananda's system, just in case anybody wants reference there. But the Bhaktis, they embrace the love for God, and God is everywhere. Embrace the path. So as part of the embraced path, okay, the complete acceptance and love for the world, Tantra sort of develops. And the aspect of Kundalini, Shakti energy, which is manifest most powerfully in this realm in sexual energy, which is the creative principle, ultimately, right, or manifestation of it. You get what's called the left-handed path and the right-handed path. And there are a couple of books on this, but everybody's a little bit on the intellectual side. But ultimately, you have a path that's a right-handed path, which is by ritual alone, where you symbolically embrace and perform these rituals. And we believe that that's what Ramakrishna did. At the end, he had a Tantric guru. And then there's a left-handed path. And they drink, and they booze, and they have words. They're Dionysians, basically. And through this, not necessarily orgic, but through this sort of embracing of the of pleasure and of bliss here, that is in fact that's their way forward. Now, a couple of things. First of all, you start with the premise that you are sort of a biomechanically engineered energy reactor, right? The Kundalini, right, and the serpents spinning up the spine, that's where the energy comes through. And you have these sort of chakras, 7 of them, the heart being the strongest of them. And then as your chakras above your heart are awakened, blossomed, different levels of awareness open up to you. Higher levels of awareness and consciousness open up to you, right? The Shakti and the Kundalini energy is the very same energy that runs down the base of the spine, and that you are effectively using when you have sex, when you have intercourse. And so there's a recognition of this, and there's certain retention and other rituals that can be performed, and that can be managed to manipulate and harness and ultimately transmute this energy, which is the ultimate goal, because if you're on this journey, your goal is for liberation. Liberation is up. But it's up in terms of, the chakras, but also the vibrational frequency. You're not only just a physical form, but you're geometrically, you sort of expand as you come up from a dimensional consciousness perspective. So if you think about, you're not just a perpendicular cylinder. You're not. You're sort of from a dimensional awareness and vibrational frequency perspective. As you move up in the chakras, the whole geometric structure that underpins your physical form sort of expands at the same time. And so you're playing around with these energies, basically. And first of all, the path is real. No one's going to tell you about it. No one's going to talk about it. But you can and you should, certainly. And one of the things that I think is important for us, given the world that we live in, where there's porn everywhere and where everything is sexualized all around us, you need to at least understand that there's another way other than complete renunciation. And that other way involves recognizing the beauty and the divine that's within it, in particular in that sort of creative energy, embracing it, respecting it, and transmuting it, ultimately, offering it up. Offering it up to your higher self, offering it up to the good of humanity, it's a thinning of the ego. That's the whole process, right? Because ultimately, all we are and have is this sort of divine consciousness, is this sort of soul. That's who we are in our essence. It's the illusion of self that stands in the way of realizing that. That's what people in advanced meditation, that's what people end up realizing. That it's staring you in the face the whole time. It's right there. It's like it's right behind your head, but you can't see it. So yogic practices, ultimately, whether it's Tantra or karma yoga or Ghana yoga, whatever you're doing, you are thinning the ego. You're just chopping away at it. And then it falls off. There's an element of grace. I don't even know what that means, because it implies a distinction. It falls off. But so, this bliss searching exercise, which of course I'm doing, everybody's doing, right? I was doing it for years. You need to have something that propels you forward. But it doesn't, you don't even want it to have you don't want to have a radical shift in consciousness and way. Trust me, it's very difficult to absorb and synthesize and ground some of these ideas once you fully appreciate and understand them. So you don't want these massive spikes in consciousness. The bliss. No, you want a gradual increase where your external circumstances and your internal circumstances have time to align. Because if they radically shift, shit gets bumpy. People's jobs, personal, family stuff, and shit gets really bumpy. So you want sort of a gradual introduction of these ideas. But and I'll start to close here a little bit. But you got to start with this understanding that you're not who you think you are. And materialism and objective realism is not necessarily wrong, but it's incomplete. And there's a different perspective. And the different perspective stems from, identification that there is something that powers this form, and what is that is closer to you than this form is, right? Whatever that is. And we are, from a physics standpoint, we are energy and vibrational frequency. And light has a lot to do with how this whole thing is put together. And thought, the physical and the mental and, let's say the spiritual, as you get sort of finer and finer and more subtle, right? Sort of at the top, you have sort of this cosmic quantum energy field of energy that we sort of observe. And at that level, the subatomic level, right? Thought is, they're ripples in this cosmic quantum energy field. They're ripples. And we, as sort of singularities of consciousness, have the ability to set these ripples into motion that manifest in the physical world, but also, have an even greater effect in the mental world. And this sort of mental construct, this collective unconscious, is what Jung called it, right? Is this sort of storehouse of archetypical psychological themes, myths. Does it speak to your heart? More or less. This is an ideological and sort of intellectual web that is integrally related to the human race on the planet Earth. And there's multiple of them, right? But this sort of collective unconscious is sort of it's almost a socio-political construct. The Western mind, the Eastern mind, they're ideological frameworks that have a real existence in this sort of mental sphere. And this is when you get these radical shifts, like when Christianity is really imposed upon the Roman Empire in the 4th century. During the Enlightenment and the Age of Science, you have these sort of radical shifts in consciousness. In the 20th century, in the quantum era, you had sort of a stepwise improvement or stepwise of, hey, things aren't really what we thought they were. But now we're starting to realize as the technology has evolved and we can really truly collaborate and see what's going on. The end of that shift that began at the beginning of the 20th century is starting to take shape. You're starting to turn on the final edge of it. What do all these things mean when we put them together? And this new intellectual kind of framework that I've created, that I'm trying to explain, where all these things piece together, that has nothing to do with religion, more has to do with metaphysics. The structures by which the physical world has come into existence and is maintained. We then are tasked with building a structure, an intellectual structure again, that can support and maintain us, this physical world, into the future. That's the task at hand. Okay? Snow Cone Diaries is the expose of that process taking place, one way or the other. It's going to happen. It's just a question of what that framework looks like. The new framework is being constructed. We have an opportunity to influence that framework. How do we do that? We understand these ideas and we implement them in our lives, in our physical forms, and who we interact with. You're connected with everybody and everything. Stop being such a dick. Stop being such an asshole. Again, these are notes to self. Don't take them personally. But be a better member of your community. Be a better member of your household. It starts simple. Anyway, I'll leave it at that. Thanks for joining. Snow Cone Diaries entry Thursday, September 30th. Peace.